What would you do if your family boarded a plane, expecting nothing more than a quiet journey home, only to be singled out, humiliated, and nearly thrown off for no reason other than the color of your skin? What if the very person entrusted to protect passenger safety instead turned against you, twisting rules and fueling division right there in the sky? This isn't just about one family. It's about dignity. It's about truth. And it's about what happens when an entire plane full of strangers must decide whether to stay silent or to stand up against injustice at 30,000 feet. As the plane soars through turbulence both in the sky and in the human heart, a father's calm strength, a mother's resilience, and the unwavering voices of their children ignite a chain of events that no one on board will ever forget. But here's the real question. What happens when the truth can no longer be hidden, and justice lands with the weight of the entire world watching stay with us? This is a story that will challenge your heart, shake your assumptions, and leave you asking yourself, what would I have done if you believe stories like this need to be told? Please like this video, share it with others, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. The hum of the engines was steady, almost comforting, as Flight 371 lifted away from the runway. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the cabin, soft light spilling through oval windows onto the passengers who were settling in for the journey east. Some scrolled on phones, others closed their eyes against the headrest, while a few parents whispered to restless children. The cabin smelled faintly of recycled air, plastic trays, and the lingering sweetness of coffee. In row 14, the Coleman family sat together, a neat line of 5. To any casual glance, they blended in like any other travelers. David Coleman adjusted his seatbelt and glanced down at his youngest son, Ethan, who was bent over a puzzle book, pencil tapping lightly against the page. The boy's brow was furrowed in concentration, his lips moving silently as he tried to fit numbers into neat squares. David smiled quietly, letting the sight soothe him. It reminded him that despite the turbulence of the outside world, family was its own safe harbor. Beside Ethan sat Angela, David's wife. Her laptop was open, the faint glow of a Word document lighting her face. She was reviewing contracts, something she often did on flights, making the most of uninterrupted hours. Her posture was straight, her fingers tapping with quiet efficiency. Angela was the kind of person who seemed to hold both warmth and steel in equal measure. She could listen with deep empathy one moment and cut through arguments with razor precision the next. David often marveled at how she carried herself calm, controlled, formidable, without ever needing to raise her voice. Next to Angela sat Malik, their eldest, 17, and already with the air of a young man stepping into responsibility. His phone was in his hands, earbuds tucked in. But David noticed he wasn't watching a show or listening to music. Malik was filming out the window, capturing the way the clouds broke open into a breathtaking sea of white below. He liked recording details, preserving moments, small acts of memory-making. Perhaps, David thought, Malik understood better than most that some things deserved to be witnessed and remembered. Beside Malik was Naomi, 15, thoughtful and sharp-eyed. She leaned her head against the window, a journal open in her lap, pen poised as though she were mid-thought. She had been writing since they left the gate, her pages filling with fragments, sometimes poems, sometimes questions she didn't yet know how to answer. Naomi's voice, even at her age, carried a clarity that often startled strangers. There was no hesitation when she spoke truth, no shyness when she named what others danced around. David knew that her words often landed like arrows, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. The family seemed peaceful, absorbed in their quiet rituals. David adjusted his seatbelt and leaned back. He loved these moments, the five of them in a row, suspended in the sky, caught between departure and destination. It was rare in their busy lives to be so close, without interruptions. He glanced down the aisle, noting the quiet rustle of newspapers, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional ding of the seatbelt sign. Everything seemed ordinary. Everything seemed safe. And yet, David couldn't help noticing the way the flight attendant in charge, Catherine Doyle, passed by their row with a look that lingered a little too long. She was tall, her uniform crisp, her blonde hair pulled into a perfect bun. Her steps were brisk, efficient, but her eyes, sharp and appraising, seemed to hold something else. It wasn't the polite detachment of someone doing her job. It was as if she were cataloging, assessing, deciding something about them before a word had been exchanged. David shifted slightly, meeting her gaze briefly. Catherine's eyes flickered away, but the tightness in her jaw remained. He chose not to mention it. Not yet. Instead, David reached into the seat pocket and pulled out the Airline magazine, flipping absently through pages of glossy destinations he had already visited. His mind drifted. He had a meeting waiting for him on the other side of this flight, one that would demand all of his focus. But here, now, he wanted to remain only a father, a husband, a man sitting quietly beside the people he loved most. He wanted to believe this would be just another flight. Still, a small knot formed low in his chest. Years of experience told him when an interaction was about to turn into something more. He had lived long enough to sense tension before it was named. And he had taught himself patience, because reacting too soon often meant losing the advantage of clarity. Angela looked up from her laptop, as if sensing his thoughts. Her eyes met his, steady, questioning. He gave the faintest shake of his head, an unspoken reassurance. Not yet. Naomi shifted in her seat, closing her journal. "Dad," she whispered, "do you ever think people stare at us more than other families?" Her question caught him off guard. She wasn't looking at him now, but out the window, voice low, almost casual, though he knew better. David studied her profile. The soft curve of her cheek pressed against the glass. The seriousness that lived in her, even at 15. "Yes," he said quietly. "Sometimes they do." Why, he exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. Hey, because people see what they expect to see, not always what's there. And sometimes what they expect has nothing to do with who we really are. Naomi nodded once, lips pressing together. She didn't say anything else, but David could feel the weight of her silence. He wondered what thoughts were moving through her head, what truths she already understood at her age. The plane leveled off, the seatbelt sign chimed, and a few passengers unbuckled to stretch. Catherine Doyle moved briskly down the aisle again, her shoes clicking against the floor. She stopped briefly at row 10 to check on an elderly woman, her tone bright, professional. But when she turned back toward the Coleman family's row, her smile faded just slightly, replaced with something cooler. David caught it. So did Angela. Their eyes met again, quiet recognition passing between them. The beginning of something had taken shape. It was subtle, nearly invisible to the casual eye, but David felt it settle into the air like a change in cabin pressure. The story of this flight had not yet been written, and he knew, deep in his bones, that soon they would no longer be just another family sitting in row 14. The flight had settled into its rhythm. The beverage carts rolled quietly down the aisles, the soft clink of ice against plastic cups mixing with the hum of the engines. Passengers leaned back in their seats, some with earbuds, others lost in books or napping against window glass. For a while, everything felt normal. David Coleman glanced at his watch. They had been in the air for 20 minutes. Ethan was still bent over his puzzle book, pencil smudges on his fingers. Angela typed steadily, her brow furrowed in concentration. Malik scrolled through photos he had taken, adjusting filters, lost in his creative world. Naomi had gone back to scribbling in her journal, head tilted, pen moving quickly. It was the kind of quiet scene that, to David, always felt like a pocket of peace, a reminder that his family knew how to exist together in stillness. But the quiet didn't last. From the front of the cabin, Catherine Doyle began walking toward their row. Her steps were sharp, purposeful, and even before she spoke, David sensed what was coming. He set the magazine aside, his eyes steady on her as she stopped in the aisle beside row 14. Passengers in nearby seats looked up with mild curiosity. "Sir, ma'am," Catherine began. Her voice clipped, carrying just enough volume to command attention. "I need you and your family to gather your belongings. We've received complaints about excessive noise and disruptive behavior. You'll need to relocate to the rear of the aircraft." Her words landed like stones dropped in water, sending ripples across the cabin. Angela froze, her fingers still poised over her laptop keys. Ethan looked up, confused, pencil dangling from his hand. Malik pulled one earbud out, frowning. Naomi stopped writing, eyes flicking between her parents and the attendant. David straightened slowly, his expression calm but his chest tightening. He had felt the knot earlier. Now it was clear why. "Excuse me." Angela's tone was professional, steady, her voice carrying just enough restraint to be respectful without being submissive. "What complaints?" Catherine's eyes narrowed. She folded her arms, the authority in her posture unmistakable. "Several passengers have mentioned the smell of food coming from your row. Others said your children are being loud. We take passenger comfort very seriously." The cabin grew quiet. Conversations tapered off. The man across the aisle closed his laptop, his curiosity piqued. A young woman a few rows ahead slowly tilted her phone, the lens angled discreetly toward the scene. David spoke evenly. "We haven't eaten anything on this flight. My children have been quiet since takeoff. Perhaps there's a misunderstanding." Catherine's jaw tightened. "Sir, I am responsible for ensuring everyone's comfort. We can resolve this quickly if you comply." Angela closed her laptop with a measured click. Her eyes were sharp now, her legal instincts kicking in. "And if we don't comply, what specific rule have we broken?" The silence that followed was heavy. Catherine's gaze darted to the faces around her, realizing eyes were on her, phones in hand. She pressed on anyway. Company policy grants crew members the discretion to relocate passengers when necessary. Naomi's voice, soft but clear, cut through the tense air. Necessary for what we're not doing anything wrong. She turned to her mother, her teenage certainty edged with both fear and courage. "Mom, is this because we're black?" Her words froze the aisle. They hung there, heavier than the recycled air, heavier than the hum of the engines. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, while others raised their phones higher, now openly recording. Catherine's face paled. "This has nothing to do with race. This is about passenger comfort and compliance." Malik finally spoke, his voice firm. "Everyone around us looks comfortable. Nobody seems bothered except you." From row 12, a woman with dark hair and a phone in her hand whispered into her device. "This is happening right now on my flight." Her name was Isabella Cruz, and her live stream had just reached 100 viewers. David lifted a hand slightly, a silent signal to his son to hold back. His voice remained calm, almost disarmingly so. "If there are documented complaints, may we see them?" Catherine stiffened. "Are you questioning my authority?" "Sir, I'm asking for clarity," David replied evenly. "If there are specific complaints, there should be records." The hum of whispers spread through the cabin. The tension was no longer just between Catherine and the Colemans. The passengers were becoming witnesses, participants in the unfolding scene. Angela leaned forward, her tone still measured. "Company policy doesn't override federal law. FAA regulations state passengers must comply with crew instructions related to safety. If this is not about safety, then you need to provide documentation." Catherine's cheeks flushed. She wasn't used to passengers who spoke with such calm precision. She glanced down the aisle as if seeking support from her junior colleague. Lily Nien appeared near the galley, tablet in hand, hesitation written across her face. Catherine beckoned her forward. "Do you have the relocation form?" Lily nodded, glancing at the family with an apologetic expression. She handed the tablet over. Catherine tapped a few keys, then turned it toward Angela. "Disruptive behavior. Food odors." Angela read the words carefully. "Noted. Please also note that no food has been consumed by this family during this flight, and please document the exact time and details of the alleged disruption." She turned to Malik. "Write it down." Malik opened his notes app, his thumbs moving swiftly. 2:47 p.m. Crew alleging food odors and disruptive behavior. No food consumed. Children engaged in reading, writing, puzzles. No raised voices. Catherine's lips tightened. Phones need to be put away during crew instructions. Angela looked directly at her. "There is no regulation prohibiting note-taking during level flight, unless this instruction is related to safety. We are in compliance." The tension crackled. A passenger 2 rows behind cleared her throat. "Excuse me. I've been sitting here the whole time. This family has been perfectly quiet. I don't know what complaints you're talking about." Her voice was firm, her eyes steady. She pulled out her phone. "And I'm documenting this for my travel blog." The cabin stirred. Several heads turned. The atmosphere shifted from passive observation to something like solidarity. David leaned back, his hands folded calmly in his lap. Inside, however, a storm churned. He could feel the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior, the sting of being singled out yet again, the weight of his children's questioning eyes. Naomi's words echoed in his mind. "Is this because we're black?" He wanted to tell her no, to protect her from the truth, to shield her from the ugliness of bias that had haunted generations. But the evidence was before them, unfolding in real time. The truth was undeniable. He breathed deeply, forcing himself into patience. He had learned long ago that the louder you shout, the easier it is for others to dismiss you. But if you remain calm, if you ask for evidence, if you demand clarity, the cracks in false authority reveal themselves. He caught Angela's gaze. She gave a slight nod. Her face set. She understood the stakes. Catherine, realizing she was losing control of the narrative, straightened her shoulders. "I'll be speaking with the captain." She turned sharply, heels clicking against the aisle floor. leaving behind a silence thick with tension. Phones lowered slightly, whispers rose, and the Colemans sat in the center of it all, still as stone. The storm had arrived, and everyone knew this was only the beginning. Captain Thomas Reed stepped out from the cockpit 20 minutes later, his uniform jacket buttoned, his expression serious but composed. The cabin hushed as soon as he appeared. Passengers sat straighter, eyes following him, phones angled discreetly. Authority had entered the aisle, and with it came the weight of judgment. David Coleman remained seated, his hands folded in his lap. He watched carefully as Catherine Doyle approached the captain, her words low but urgent. Passengers leaned forward, straining to catch fragments. He could see the captain's brow furrow as she spoke. He nodded once, then raised a hand for silence. "Good afternoon," Captain Reed said, his voice carrying over the hum of the engines. "I understand there have been concerns raised regarding a family in row 14. I want to address this personally." He turned toward the Colemans. "Sir, ma'am, I've been told there are passenger complaints about your behavior. Would you mind explaining your side?" Angela's posture was composed, her voice even. "Captain, we have not eaten food on this flight. We have not spoken above normal conversation levels. My children are engaged in reading, puzzles, and journaling. We have not disturbed anyone," David added calmly. "We asked for the documented complaints. So far, nothing specific has been shown." The captain looked toward Catherine. How many complaints, and from which passengers? Catherine hesitated. 2 verbal complaints, about food odors and noise. Captain Reed's gaze sharpened. Verbal only, nothing written. No specific passengers identified. Catherine's face flushed. They were concerned. "Captain, I documented them per protocol." She held out the tablet, the vague note visible. Passenger complaints regarding family in row 14. Food odors, noise, no names, no times, no details. Reed sighed, glancing around the cabin. What he saw did not match the picture Catherine painted. Passengers were watching quietly, not annoyed, not disturbed. If anything, their expressions ranged from curiosity to indignation. He saw phones pointed at him, recording. He understood what that meant. Every word he spoke would outlive this flight. "Sir, ma'am," Reed said, turning back to the Colemans, "I don't see a violation of safety regulations here, but I want to be thorough. Passengers, if anyone has experienced actual disruption, please raise your hand." The cabin remained silent. Not a single hand lifted. Instead, a woman in row 12 spoke up. Her phone raised steadily. "Captain, I've been sitting near this family since boarding. They've been nothing but quiet and respectful. There's no disturbance." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the rows. Catherine stiffened. "Captain, with respect, passengers don't always voice complaints directly." A deep voice cut her off. From row 16, an elderly man with silver hair and glasses lowered his newspaper. "I've been flying for 40 years, he said calmly. "If this family is disruptive, then I must be deaf." They've been the most polite passengers here. His name, David would later learn, was Arthur Bell. The shift was palpable. Authority, once balanced in Catherine's hands, now wavered. The passengers were siding with the family. The captain's eyes narrowed. He knew it too. Naomi closed her journal. She looked up at Catherine, her brown eyes sharp with clarity that belied her age. Her voice came soft but steady, each word deliberate. "Are we being treated this way because we're black?" The air in the cabin stilled. It was a question that had been lurking beneath every accusation, every vague complaint, every sideways glance. Now it had been named, spoken aloud by a 15-year-old girl. Catherine's face went pale. "That has nothing to do with this," she said quickly. "This is about passenger comfort and compliance." "Whose comfort?" Naomi pressed. "Everyone looks fine except you." The honesty in her tone landed with the force of truth. Passengers shifted, some nodding subtly, others raising their phones higher. Isabella Cruz whispered into her live stream. "You heard that she just asked the real question." Her viewer count jumped past 500. Malik finally broke his silence, his phone resting against the tray table. "Recording. We've been nothing but quiet. If this is about something else, just say it." Angela touched his arm gently, signaling restraint. But her eyes never left Catherine. "Captain Reed, you can see for yourself. This is not about noise or food. This is about perception, unconscious bias, at best." David remained silent, watching, weighing. Inside him, emotions battled. He wanted to shield Naomi, to protect her from having to ask that question aloud. He hated that she even recognized the pattern, but part of him also felt a quiet pride. She had spoken truth with courage, with dignity. And she had done what so many adults feared to do, name discrimination as it happened. Reed rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Catherine, I need actual grounds to relocate passengers. Federal regulations are clear. Comfort is subjective. Safety is objective. Do you have any safety concern with this family?" Catherine's lips parted, then closed. She had no answer. "No," Reed said firmly, his voice carrying authority that brooked no challenge. "Then there is no relocation." Relief rippled subtly through the Coleman family, but David did not relax fully. He knew from experience that a battle diffused was not always a battle ended. Catherine's rigid posture told him she wasn't done, and he was right. Catherine straightened. "Captain, I must insist. Their attitude has been confrontational. That alone creates a hostile environment." Angela's voice was steady, controlled. "Requesting evidence is not confrontation. Asking for clarity is not hostility. We are following every regulation. We deserve the same treatment as any other passengers." Catherine's eyes darted across the cabin, but what she found was not support. Dozens of eyes stared back, skeptical, critical, phones still recording. From row 10, Isabella's voice floated out. "People are already watching this live. Over 1,000 right now. Everyone can see who's hostile here." The blood drained from Catherine's face. She hadn't realized how quickly the story had spread beyond the confines of the aircraft. David's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. He knew what it likely was: notifications from corporate, messages he could not yet acknowledge. Not until the moment was right. For now, he focused on what mattered: his family, the truth, and the dignity they would not surrender. Naomi leaned closer to him. "Dad, why is she still pushing?" she whispered. He looked at her, his voice soft. "Because some people can't see past what they expect. But truth has a way of showing itself. Let it. Stay calm." She nodded, though her hands clenched around her pen. The captain finally raised a hand, signaling an end to the debate. "That's enough. The family will remain in their seats. Catherine, return to your duties." But the senior flight attendant didn't move. Pride battled protocol in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak again, then stopped. For the first time, she looked uncertain, and David knew with absolute certainty that this was far from over. The cabin was no longer the quiet, anonymous space it had been at takeoff. An invisible line had been drawn, and everyone on board knew it. Some passengers leaned forward, eager to catch every word. Others pulled out phones, recording, their screens glowing like watchful eyes. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, underscoring the tension that hung in the recycled air. David Coleman sat still, his shoulders relaxed but his mind sharp, scanning the room. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than argument. Every word spoken in haste could be twisted. Every raised voice could become a weapon against you. And yet, he also knew the importance of witnesses. Already cameras were rolling. The truth was being documented, not just remembered. Angela leaned slightly toward him. "It's not ending here," she whispered. "I know," David replied softly. "Stay calm." Across the aisle, Catherine Doyle walked briskly toward the galley, her heels clicking, her movements taut with frustration. She disappeared behind the curtain for several minutes. When she emerged, her expression was composed but brittle, like glass stretched too thin. She walked directly to the intercom and pressed the button. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice rang through the speakers, calm but edged with authority. "As a reminder, crew instructions are to be followed at all times. Noncompliance may result in law enforcement intervention upon landing." The words were carefully chosen, but everyone knew where they were aimed. Heads turned toward row 14, phones lifted higher. Naomi's hand clenched around her journal. "She's threatening us," she whispered to her mother. Angela's hand rested lightly on her daughter's. "She's trying to intimidate us, but intimidation only works if we give in." Malik leaned back, phone steady in his hand. "Live streams are over 2,000 now," he murmured. "People are already commenting." David said nothing, but inside, he felt the slow burn of anger mixed with resolve. He hated that his children were learning this lesson at 30,000 feet, that fairness was not guaranteed, that dignity had to be defended in the face of power that refused to see them clearly. A voice from behind them broke the silence. "Excuse me," Arthur Bell said, his tone measured but firm. The elderly man adjusted his glasses and stood slightly in the aisle. "I'd like to say something, Captain, if I may." Captain Reed, still standing near the cockpit door, nodded cautiously. Arthur turned to face the passengers. "I've been flying for decades. I've seen children cry, people argue, travelers spill drinks and make scenes. That family," he gestured to the Colemans, "has done none of that. They've sat quietly, minding their own business. If there is a disturbance on this plane, it's not coming from row 14. A wave of murmurs passed through the cabin. Several passengers nodded in agreement. Isabella Cruz, phone in hand, stood up in her row. Her live stream camera pointed directly at herself now. For those of you watching, this is happening in real time. Over 3,000 people are tuned in. You can see the truth with your own eyes. A black family is being harassed on this flight for no reason." Catherine's face tightened. "That is a misrepresentation," she snapped, her composure slipping. Isabella turned the camera toward her. "Then explain. Ma'am, explain exactly what this family has done." Catherine faltered. Her lips parted, then closed again. The silence was damning. The junior attendant, Lily Nguyen, stepped forward hesitantly. "Captain," she said quietly, "I've been monitoring the cabin. I haven't witnessed any disruptive behavior from the Colemans." Her voice shook slightly, but her honesty carried weight. The shift was undeniable. Passengers began speaking up, one after another. "I haven't heard a thing from them. They've been quieter than most people here. This is targeting." Plain and simple. Catherine's authority crumbled under the tide of voices. But she wasn't finished. "Captain," she said sharply, turning on Reed, "you're undermining your crew. If we allow passengers to challenge us, we lose control. This family has been argumentative and confrontational." Angela rose slightly in her seat, her voice calm but cutting. "Asking for documentation is not confrontation. Requesting fairness is not disruption. If fairness feels like defiance, perhaps the problem isn't us." The words landed with precision. Passengers nodded. Some even clapped softly. Phones captured every syllable. David remained seated, his face composed. But his mind was a battlefield. He hated that Angela had to defend their basic dignity. He hated that Naomi had been forced to name the truth aloud. He hated the way Ethan clutched his pencil now, wide-eyed, sensing the tension but not fully understanding. Still, he also felt pride. Pride that his wife's voice was unshakable, that his children were learning to stand with dignity, that strangers were choosing solidarity over silence. Captain Reed raised a hand. "Enough," he said firmly. "This debate ends here. The family will remain in their seats. Catherine, return to your duties." But Catherine's eyes burned. "Captain, I cannot guarantee passenger comfort if hostility continues." "Then perhaps," Reed replied coldly, "the hostility isn't coming from the passengers." Gas rippled through the rows. Catherine stiffened, color rising in her cheeks. She spun on her heel and marched back toward the galley. Her jaw clenched. The tension lingered. But the cabin exhaled. Naomi leaned close to her father. "Did we win?" she whispered. David's eyes softened. "It's not about winning," he murmured. "It's about truth. And truth has a way of shining through, no matter how hard people try to bury it." Angela closed her laptop, folding her hands in her lap. "The truth is shining now. But this isn't over. Not yet." She was right, because as Catherine disappeared behind the curtain, she pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. She was reaching higher, calling for reinforcements. And in that moment, David understood the battle had shifted. It was no longer just between them and one flight attendant. Soon, it would be between them and the entire system that stood behind her. The curtain to the galley swayed as Catherine Doyle slipped behind it, her figure disappearing from view. For a moment, the cabin exhaled, but the relief was fragile, temporary. David Coleman knew it. He had felt enough of these battles in his life to recognize the rhythm of pause before the next strike. He leaned back in his seat, eyes half closed, but his thoughts raced. He could sense Angela's tension beside him, the way her fingers tapped lightly against her armrest. She was planning, rehearsing, calculating each possible scenario. Malek's phone camera remained steady, capturing everything. Naomi scribbled furiously in her journal, her pen scratching like a tiny drumbeat. Ethan leaned against his mother's shoulder, his young face etched with confusion. "Dad," Naomi whispered, "what happens if she calls the police?" David opened his eyes and met hers, steady and calm. "Then we stay calm too. We speak the truth, and we let everyone see it." But inside, his stomach knotted. The word police carried weight that no child should have to fear midair. Meanwhile, in the galley, Catherine's hand shook slightly as she dialed into the crew communication system. Her voice was tight, urgent. "Ground control. This is Flight 227 mid-route from Denver to New York. We have a situation escalating in the cabin. A family in row 14 is non-compliant and argumentative. I request instructions for potential removal upon arrival." The voice that answered was professional, calm, but tinged with caution. Copy that. 227. Please clarify. Is this a safety issue? Catherine hesitated, glancing at the curtain as though it could hide her uncertainty. It is a disruption to crew authority and passenger comfort. Noted? Without a direct safety violation, removal requires documentation and justification. Can you provide that? Her jaw clenched. I've already logged complaints. The captain is undermining crew authority. There was a pause on the line. Understood. We'll elevate this to corporate for review. Hold position. Catherine ended the call, her pulse racing. She knew what she had just triggered. This was no longer just a cabin disagreement. It was becoming a corporate matter. And once corporate entered the picture, reputations hers and theirs were on the line. Back in the cabin, Captain Reed returned to the cockpit, but the tension didn't leave with him. Passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring softly. The Colemans remained in their row, a calm center amid the whispers and flickering phone screens. Isabella Cruz checked her live stream numbers. 4,000 live now, she murmured into her phone, her voice low but intense. People are furious. They're commenting nonstop. Some are tagging news outlets already. Angela heard her and leaned closer to David. It's spreading, she said quietly. David gave a small nod. Good. The more eyes, the safer we are. But even as he said it, he wondered. Visibility was a double-edged sword. Yes, it brought protection, but it also brought exposure. Once a story entered the bloodstream of the internet, it could be twisted, weaponized, turned into something it was not. Minutes later, Catherine emerged from the galley. Her expression was neutral, her steps precise. But David caught the flicker in her eyes. Something had shifted. She was no longer just a flight attendant dealing with passengers. She was an emissary of the system, backed by forces unseen. She approached their row, her voice cool. Upon arrival, law enforcement will meet the aircraft. I strongly suggest you comply and make this process easier. The cabin gasped collectively. Phones rose higher, Malik whispered. She really called them. Angela's jaw tightened. She spoke clearly, for the entire cabin to hear. We have complied with every regulation. We have disturbed no one. Any attempt to remove us would be unjust and unlawful. Catherine's lips thinned. You can explain that on the ground. The passengers erupted in murmurs. Some shook their heads. Others voiced their disapproval openly. This is wrong. They didn't do anything. Unbelievable. Arthur Bell stood again, his elderly frame steady. Captain Reed. He called down the aisle. The cockpit door cracked open, and the captain looked out. If this family is removed, I will personally testify that they were not disruptive in any way, and I am not alone. He gestured around him, and several passengers nodded firmly, some raising their hands in solidarity. The atmosphere swelled with tension, not just between the Colemans and Catherine, but between the passengers and the system she represented. Naomi's voice, soft but resonant, carried again. You're calling the police for us sitting quietly. What lesson are you teaching everyone here? Her words silenced the whispers. They landed like a verdict. Phones zoomed in on her face. A young girl speaking truth to power at 30,000 feet. Catherine faltered, but only for a moment. She turned sharply and walked back toward the galley again, her posture rigid. Angela exhaled slowly, her hand brushing against David's. This is bigger than her now. David nodded. Yes, the airline will decide. And he was right. Because miles away, in a sleek office in New York, a notification pinged on the desk of Victoria Langford, CEO of East Coast Airlines. Her assistant rushed in, tablet in hand. "Ma'am, there's a live stream going viral. From Flight 227, a flight attendant is accusing a family of non-compliance. It's already trending. Victoria, sharp-eyed and seasoned. Tap the screen." She watched for 30 seconds, her jaw tightening. Then she looked up. "Patch me through to the captain immediately. Back on the plane." The intercom beeped. Captain Reed's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are in communication with corporate headquarters regarding this situation." David closed his eyes briefly, the words settling over him. Corporate. That meant escalation. That meant visibility. That meant judgment beyond this cabin. But it also meant something else. For the first time, he felt a flicker of advantage. Because once the system was watching, it wasn't just Catherine's word against theirs anymore. It was the truth against the narrative. And truth had witnesses, thousands of them. Naomi leaned closer, her voice trembling but determined. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" David looked at her, his face steady. "We'll be more than okay. We'll be seen." The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft settled into its cruising altitude, yet the tension inside the plane only sharpened, stretching taut like a rope about to snap. Every whisper carried weight. Every phone screen captured fragments of a story spreading far beyond the rows of seats. David Coleman sat still, his posture calm but his mind restless. He had spent years learning patience, letting silence work in his favor. But this was different. His children were watching, his wife was watching, and an entire cabin of strangers was watching. He felt the burden of representing not just his family, but something larger, something deeply woven into the fabric of justice and dignity. The intercom crackled, breaking the silence. "This is Captain Reed," the voice said, steady but laced with tension. "We are now in direct communication with East Coast Airlines headquarters. Please remain seated as we await further instruction." Angela glanced at David, her brows furrowing. "Headquarters. That means they've pulled in corporate already." David gave a small nod. "It means someone higher is watching." "That might be what saves us," Malik whispered without looking up from his phone. "Live streams at 5,000 now. People are tagging news outlets and civil rights groups. Comments are blowing up." Naomi stopped writing in her journal. Her voice was quiet but resolute. If people are watching, then the truth can't be hidden anymore. Ethan, his young voice filled with confusion, looked up at his father. "Why do they think we're bad when we didn't do anything?" David's chest tightened. He reached over, squeezing his son's hand gently. "Because sometimes people see what they expect, not what's real. But the truth always finds a way through." Behind the curtain in the galley, Catherine Doyle paced like a caged animal. Her authority had been undermined, her judgment questioned in front of passengers and cameras. She couldn't let this family walk off the plane vindicated. It would mark her as weak, as a failure. She picked up the handset again. "Ground control. This is Doyle. What's the directive from corporate?" The reply came through the headset. "Stand by. The CEO is reviewing the footage." Catherine's eyes widened. The CEO herself. That meant her every action would now be scrutinized, judged not by crew regulations, but by company survival instincts. Thousands of miles away, in a sleek corner office overlooking Manhattan, Victoria Langford leaned back in her leather chair. Her dark hair framed a face honed by years of negotiations and crises. On her tablet, the live stream played. comments flooding the screen. Words like discrimination, profiling, and unfair treatment jumped out again and again. She muted the sound for a moment. Closing her eyes, she had built East Coast Airlines into a respected brand, one that prided itself on inclusivity and service. This video threatened all of it. In less than an hour, it could spiral into headlines, boycotts, calls for accountability. She needed to control the narrative before it consumed them. "Get me the captain," she ordered. Moments later, in the cockpit, Captain Reed picked up his headset. "This is Reed. Thomas." Victoria's voice came clear, precise. "I'm watching the live stream. I've seen enough to know this situation was mishandled." Reed exhaled slowly. "I agree, ma'am. There's no grounds for removal." "Good. Then the family stays. But I want this defused before we land. We cannot have law enforcement pulling a compliant family off one of our planes on camera. Do you understand what that would do to us?" "I do." Reed hesitated. "But Catherine is insistent. She's claiming loss of crew authority." Victoria's voice sharpened. "Authority means nothing if it becomes abuse. Handle it. And Thomas, record everything. I'll deal with Doyle myself when you land." "Yes, ma'am." The line went dead. Reed rubbed his temple. He knew Catherine well. She was proud, unyielding. Backing down wasn't in her nature. But now he had orders from the very top. The conflict had shifted again, and he was stuck in the middle. The cockpit door opened. Reed stepped back into the cabin, his expression grave but steady. Passengers looked up, phones raised. The Colemans watched silently, waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reed began, his voice firm. "Corporate headquarters has reviewed this situation. They have confirmed there are no grounds for removal. The family in row 14 will remain in their seats for the duration of this flight. I ask that all passengers respect this resolution and allow the crew to return to normal duties." The cabin erupted with murmurs, relief, approval, even light applause. Isabella Cruz grinned into her live stream. "You heard it. The CEO herself is stepping in. The family is safe, for now." Angela reached for David's hand, squeezing it tightly. Naomi smiled faintly, though her eyes remained sharp with awareness. Malik whispered, "The comments are exploding. People are saying the airline had no choice once it went viral. But Catherine Doyle wasn't finished." She emerged from the galley, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "Captain, with all respect, you're undermining crew integrity. If one family can challenge us like this, others will follow." Reed's jaw tightened. "Catherine, that's an order from corporate. This is not up for debate." Catherine's voice rose, breaking the fragile calm. "And what about my authority? What about the precedent?" This set's passengers shifted uncomfortably. Phones angled toward her. Isabella whispered into her mic, "She's unraveling." David remained silent, but inside, he wrestled with conflicting impulses. Part of him wanted to stand, to call out the injustice again, but another part reminded him of the power of restraint. He had already seen how calm could cut deeper than anger. Instead, he folded his hands in his lap, meeting Catherine's glare with quiet strength. Angela, however, spoke softly but clearly. "Authority is not a weapon. It's a responsibility, and you've forgotten that." The word struck like a chord, resonating through the cabin. Passengers nodded, murmurs of agreement rising. Catherine's face reddened. She opened her mouth to retort, but Reed raised his hand. "Enough," he commanded. "This discussion is over. Return to your post." Catherine's chest rose and fell rapidly. For a moment, It seemed she might refuse. Then, with stiff movements, she turned and stalked back to the galley, the curtain swishing behind her like a closing stage. The cabin exhaled again, tension loosening slightly, but David knew better. This was not over. Not while the plane was still in the air. Not while pride and prejudice still simmered in the shadows. Naomi leaned close to him. "Dad, why can't she just stop?" David looked at her, his eyes steady. "Because stopping means admitting she was wrong. And some people would rather burn themselves down than face that truth." Naomi's lips pressed together, her pen scratching across the page of her journal once more. Above them, the plane cruised through the darkening sky. But inside the cabin, the storm had only just begun. The cabin had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The hum of the engines filled the silence, punctuated by the occasional cough, the rustle of pages turning, or the quiet beeps of phones as passengers scrolled and recorded. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered, invisible but undeniable. David Coleman kept his posture calm, his hands folded on his lap. Outwardly, he was stillness itself. Inside, though, his thoughts turned like gears grinding in the dark. He had not asked for this confrontation, yet here it was, stretching out like a trial before witnesses, each decision amplified by cameras and eyes. Angela leaned slightly toward him, her voice low. "She is not finished." David nodded almost imperceptibly. "I know. Pride is a stubborn thing." Behind the galley curtain, Catherine Doyle leaned against the counter, her fists clenched. Her authority had been stripped from her by the captain, undermined by corporate, humiliated before passengers. She could already imagine the conversations waiting for her once they landed. Reports filed, reviews conducted, her name tarnished, unless she salvaged it, unless she proved herself right. She turned to Lily Nguyen, the younger flight attendant who lingered nearby, folding napkins with trembling hands. "You saw it, Lily," Catherine pressed, her voice sharp. "You saw how they questioned me, how they challenged the authority of this crew." Lily hesitated, her lips parting but no words forming. "Say it," Catherine urged. "We cannot allow passengers to set the rules. If this continues, none of us will have control in the air." Lily's eyes lowered. Her voice was soft, almost inaudible, but they were calm. They did not raise their voices. Catherine's jaw tightened. Calm can be deceptive. Disruption doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it is defiance hidden in silence. You must understand, authority is all we have up here. Without it, chaos rules. Lily swallowed, her hands trembling slightly. She nodded, but it was a hollow nod. Catherine knew she did not truly believe it. Passengers, however, did believe what they had seen, and their whispers carried a different story. Across the aisle, Isabella Cruz adjusted her phone, whispering into her live stream. 6,000 now. People are flooding the chat with outrage. They're demanding accountability. Arthur Bell leaned forward in his seat, his voice low but firm. The more they push, the more foolish they look. It's already out of their hands. David overheard him, offering a respectful nod. "Thank you," he murmured. Arthur returned the nod. "This is not just about you anymore. Mr. Coleman, this is about every passenger who wonders if they'll be treated fairly the next time they fly." Naomi scribbled in her journal, pausing only to whisper, "He's right. Dad, it's bigger than us." "Yes," David agreed softly. "It always was." Minutes passed, heavy and slow. Then the curtain parted again. Catherine re-emerged, her expression carefully composed, though her eyes still flickered with fire. She walked down the aisle, pausing near the Coleman's row. She spoke loudly enough for others to hear, her tone rehearsed. "I want to remind all passengers," she said, "that this flight is still under crew authority. Respect for staff instructions is not optional. We are here for your safety." Several passengers exchanged glances, unimpressed. One middle-aged man near the back spoke up, his voice firm. "Respect goes both ways." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. Phones rose again, capturing her every word, every reaction. Catherine's jaw tightened, but she pressed on. "Anyone who continues to interfere will also be reported upon landing." This time, Isabella Cruz laughed openly, her phone camera fixed on Catherine. "Interfere? You mean recording what we see? You can't silence the truth. Ma'am, not anymore. Thousands are watching this right now." Catherine's eyes darted to the glowing screens, the lenses that turned her every move into evidence. For a moment, her mask slipped, and raw frustration twisted across her face. Angela's voice broke through the murmurs, calm and steady. "Authority that fears witnesses is not authority at all. It is insecurity." The words landed like stones in a still pond, sending ripples across the rows. Passengers nodded. Some even clapped softly. David glanced at Angela. Admiration mingled with concern. He knew her words were sharp, undeniable, but he also knew they would cut Catherine deeply, and wounds like that often led to reckless retaliation. Catherine turned abruptly and marched back toward the galley. But her retreat was no victory. The passengers had seen, and they were no longer neutral. They were no longer silent. The balance of power had shifted again, and this time it tilted toward truth. Naomi leaned close to her father, her young eyes alight with conviction. "People are standing up. Dad, not just for us, for what's right." David placed a gentle hand over hers. "Yes, that is the power of witnesses. Injustice cannot survive the light." Yet even as he said it, he wondered how long the light would last. Catherine was stubborn, and pride rarely surrendered without one last desperate strike. In her seat near the back, Isabella whispered into her live stream, 7,000 now, and people are already calling it the flight that exposed East Coast Airlines. The comments are pouring in, some are even tagging the CEO herself. Little did Isabella know, the CEO was already watching, her decisions shaping the outcome of every passing minute. For now, though, the cabin existed in that fragile balance, suspended between sky and earth, between conflict and resolution. Passengers sat straighter, more alert. The Colemans remained steady, their calm a beacon amid turbulence that was not of the plane, but of human hearts. David breathed deeply, grounding himself in silence once more. His strength was not in fighting every word, but in standing firm, unshaken. And as the plane soared through the night sky, he knew the battle was far from over. The cabin had settled into a tense quiet, but it was the kind of silence that thrums with anticipation. Everyone knew the story wasn't finished. Passengers clutched their phones. Whispers darted like sparks. And the Colemans sat at the center of it all. Steady in the storm, David Coleman stared out the small oval window at the dark expanse of sky. The clouds below looked soft and endless, but he knew how quickly turbulence could change them. He had lived through turbulence of another kind for most of his life, but never with so many eyes fixed upon him. He exhaled slowly, reminding himself of the one truth he could hold calm was his greatest weapon. Angela glanced toward the galley curtain. "She's still back there?" she murmured. "I can feel it." Naomi hunched over her journal, looked up. "What do you mean?" Angela's lips pressed together. "Pride doesn't sit quietly. She'll try again. People like her always do. And Angela was right. Behind that curtain, Catherine Doyle gripped the crew phone with white knuckles. Her earlier calls had failed to secure the outcome she wanted. The captain had overridden her. The passengers had defied her. Corporate had dismissed her concerns. But she refused to walk off this flight branded as the villain. Her voice was tight, urgent as she called into the system again. Ground control. This is Doyle. I need immediate reassessment of the situation. I'm telling you, passenger defiance is spreading. If this isn't stopped, the crew will lose all authority. The voice on the other end was calm, almost weary. Doyle, headquarters has already reviewed. The directive stands. The family remains. Her jaw clenched. Then escalate it further. Get me someone higher. A pause. Then the reply came, clipped and firm. Stand by. Minutes later. The line clicked and a new voice came through. It was low, measured, and carried the kind of authority that silences a room without raising volume. Catherine Doyle. This is Victoria Langford. Catherine's chest tightened, her heart thudded in her ears. Ms. Langford, CEO, ma'am. Thank you. You need to know this family is eroding crew control. They've turned passengers against us. There was no anger in Victoria's voice, only precision. I've watched the footage. I've listened to passengers, and I have seen nothing to justify your actions. Authority is not eroded by passengers sitting quietly. It is eroded by misuse. Catherine sputtered, but Ma'am Victoria cut her off, her tone steely. Enough. This is not a debate. You are ordered to cease escalation immediately. Do your job. Ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers without further incident. Do I make myself clear? Catherine's throat went dry. She swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. The line went silent. For the first time that night, Catherine felt something she had resisted until now, the weight of being wrong. Back in the cabin, the intercom chimed. A voice, unfamiliar but commanding, filled the space. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Victoria Langford, CEO of East Coast Airlines. I want to assure you all that this situation is under review at the highest level. After personally examining the events, I confirm there has been no disruption that warrants removal of passengers. The family in row 14 will remain seated, with our full support. Gas rippled through the cabin. People glanced at one another, their phones recording every syllable. Isabella Cruz nearly dropped her phone in excitement. The CEO herself is speaking to us, she whispered breathlessly into her stream. Victoria's voice continued, calm but resolute. East Coast Airlines is committed to the dignity and respect of every traveler. We apologize for the distress caused during this flight. I ask for your patience as our crew continues their duties, and for your cooperation so we may all arrive safely together. For a moment, silence reigned, as if the very walls of the plane absorbed her words. Then the cabin erupted in quiet applause. It wasn't loud, not raucous, but steady and sincere, a collective acknowledgement of truth finally spoken from power. Angela's hand squeezed David's, her eyes moist but shining. Do you hear that? She whispered. David nodded, his voice low. Yes, the tide is turning. Naomi's pen flew across her page. She wasn't just recording events anymore. She was writing history, her own small chronicle of justice unfolding at 30,000 feet. Ethan leaned against his father, whispering with the innocence only a child could have. Does that mean it's over? David kissed the top of his son's head. Not yet, but it means we're not alone anymore. Across the aisle, Arthur Bell's voice carried over. Mr. Coleman, the CEO herself siding with you, that's more than just a resolution. That's vindication. David inclined his head respectfully. It's a step. Vindication comes when things like this stop happening altogether. Arthur's eyes softened, and he nodded. Meanwhile, Catherine emerged slowly from the galley. Her steps were rigid, her expression carefully blank. Yet everyone who saw her understood something inside her had cracked. The fire in her eyes was dimmer, dulled by the undeniable authority of her own CEO's voice. Passengers stared openly, some with disapproval, others with pity. Phones followed her every movement. She passed by row 14, her gaze flicking toward David and Angela. For a fleeting second, David caught something in her expression, anger. Yes, but also shame. And beneath the shame, fear. David held her gaze calmly, not with triumph, but with quiet strength. He didn't need to speak. His presence, steady and unmoved, said everything. Catherine looked away and continued down the aisle. Naomi whispered, her young voice trembling with conviction. She's not the same anymore. No, Angela said softly. She's realizing the weight of her choices. The cabin settled again, calmer this time. Conversations resumed, lighter than before. Laughter even flickered at the edges. Yet beneath the relief, everyone knew this story would live far beyond the confines of Flight 227. David leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He felt the exhaustion of the night settle into his bones. Yet alongside it, a quiet sense of triumph grew, not for himself alone, but for his family, for the witnesses who had stood with them, and for the countless unseen faces watching the live stream. The fight wasn't finished, but for the first time, it felt winnable. The night sky stretched endlessly outside the oval windows, dark and serene. But serenity in the air was always fragile. It could vanish in a heartbeat, replaced by the kind of turbulence that reminded every soul on board how small they were against the forces of nature. David Coleman had just closed his eyes when he felt it. The first jolt was small, a subtle shift in his stomach as the plane dipped slightly. Passengers murmured, some gripping armrests. Then came a stronger shudder, rattling trays and sending a half-empty soda can skidding across the aisle. A voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reed. We are experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts immediately. The cabin crew moved quickly. Lily Nguyen's voice was calm. She urged passengers to buckle in. Her hands trembled slightly, but she masked it with professional steadiness. Catherine Doyle, still stiff with pride and frustration, strapped herself into the jump seat near the galley. The plane dipped again, harder this time. Gasps echoed through the cabin. A child cried out. Luggage shifted above as bins creaked under the strain. Ethan clutched his father's arm, eyes wide with fear. Dad, what's happening? David squeezed his son's hand, steady as a rock despite the shaking around them. It's just turbulence. Son, the plane is strong. We're safe. Angela leaned close to Naomi and Malik, brushing their arms reassuringly. Seatbelts tight. Deep breaths. The cabin lights flickered for a moment as the plane jolted again, this time with a bone-deep tremor that made even David's chest tighten. The hum of engines roared louder, straining against unseen currents. Around them, passengers clutched their seats, whispered prayers, muttered reassurances. Phones slipped into laps, forgotten for the first time that night. Live streams wavered, cameras shaking with the plane itself. In that moment, everyone was reduced to the same simple truth: they were all passengers, bound together in fragility. The plane lurched to the left, trays clattering. a water bottle bouncing into the aisle. Naomi gasped, her journal tumbling to the floor. Malik quickly grabbed it, holding it tight against his chest as though preserving not just paper, but memory itself. Angela closed her eyes for a moment, whispering something softly, a prayer under her breath. David felt the tremor of her words, and for a brief instant, even he let his own silent prayer slip between clenched teeth. The intercom crackled again, Reed's voice steady but urgent. All passengers, remain seated with seatbelts secured. We are adjusting course to find stable air. Please remain calm. The aircraft shook violently, dropping for what felt like a full second before leveling out again. Screams echoed, followed by silence heavy with fear. The sound of the engines was no longer background. It was everything. In the midst of it, David's voice broke the silence, calm and low. "Look at me," he said to his children. "Look at me, not the plane. Just breathe. In and out. We're together." Naomi fixed her eyes on him, her breath catching but steadying with his rhythm. Ethan's small chest rose and fell in sync with his father's. Malik's jaw tightened, but his gaze remained on David, finding strength there. Across the aisle, Isabella Cruz's phone still streamed, the image shaking wildly, but her commentary was gone. Instead, her lips moved silently, perhaps in prayer. Arthur Bell, his eyes closed, held onto the armrest with one hand and the cross around his neck with the other, and Catherine Doyle, strapped into her seat, felt something unexpected pierce through her armor of pride. Fear, the kind that stripped away protocol and left only humanity. She glanced at Lily, who clutched the jump seat handle with white knuckles, and for once, Catherine said nothing. The plane shook again, then steadied, then shook once more. Minutes stretched like hours. Each second was its own trial, testing the will of every heart aboard. But gradually, the tremors eased. The violent dips softened into gentle rolls. And finally, after what felt like forever, the cabin grew still again. The intercom chimed. Reed's voice returned, calm and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have cleared the turbulence. We are now in stable air. You may remain seated with seatbelts fastened until further notice. Thank you for your cooperation." The cabin exhaled as one. Murmurs of relief rippled through the rows. Laughter, nervous but real, followed. Tears were wiped away discreetly. And somewhere in the back, a voice whispered, "Thank God." Ethan buried his face in David's side, his small voice muffled. "I was scared. Dad." David stroked his son's hair gently. "I know, but you were brave. You faced it." Naomi picked up her fallen journal, flipping to a blank page with trembling hands. Her pen scratched furiously. "I want to remember this. The moment when we were all the same." Angela kissed the side of her daughter's head. "Yes, baby. That's exactly what it was." Malik finally released the journal he had been holding, handing it back with a half smile. "You're going to fill that whole book before this flight is over." Naomi smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it's worth it." Around them, conversations resumed, lighter this time. Passengers shared words of comfort, small jokes, and quiet gratitude. Even strangers exchanged nods of recognition, bonded by what they had endured together. David leaned back in his seat, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into him. Turbulence had stripped away illusions, exposing something raw and undeniable. For a moment, prejudice, pride, and conflict had been silenced by the simple truth of vulnerability. He looked toward Catherine, who sat stiffly in her seat, her eyes downcast. For the first time all night, she seemed less like an adversary and more like another passenger caught in the same storm. And though her pride still lingered, David saw the faintest crack in her armor. Angela noticed it too. She whispered to David, "Sometimes it takes the sky trembling to remind us what matters." David nodded slowly. "Yes, we're all just people in the air, hoping to land safely." And though the turbulence had passed, its lesson remained, written not in policies or procedures, but in the quiet, unspoken bond that had formed in the hearts of those who had shared it. The turbulence had passed, leaving behind a hush that lingered in the cabin like the quiet after a storm. Passengers breathed easier, but no one was quite the same. Fear had stripped them all down to their most human selves. And now, in the aftermath, there was a strange intimacy in the air. People who had been strangers hours before now exchanged small smiles, reassurances, even whispered jokes as if to say, "We made it through together." David Coleman felt it too. The shift, the recognition that beneath the layers of conflict and prejudice, there had been a fleeting moment when they were all equal, all vulnerable, all simply passengers carried by the same fragile machine through the same uncertain sky. He glanced at Angela, who met his eyes with a faint smile. The storm had rattled them, but it had also reminded them of what mattered most: family, dignity, resilience. Ethan leaned into him, clutching his arm, not out of fear now, but out of comfort. "Dad, I think the plane's okay now," the boy whispered. David kissed the top of his son's head. "Yes, son, we're okay." Naomi had already returned to her journal, her pen flying across the page as if she couldn't write fast enough to capture everything. Malik, meanwhile, scrolled through his phone, watching the live stream comments pour in. His eyes widened. "Dad, you won't believe this," he murmured. "There are tens of thousands of people watching now. Some of them are tagging news stations. This is everywhere." Angela arched a brow, a mixture of pride and concern on her face. "That means this flight will not just land in Boston. It will land in the court of public opinion, too." David nodded slowly. "And that court is one I trust more than this cabin." Across the aisle, Arthur Bell cleared his throat gently. "Young man," he said to Malik, "you might want to save some of that footage. When this is over, it could be the most important record of what happened tonight." Malik grinned faintly. "Already done." Arthur's eyes twinkled, and he leaned back, satisfied. Not everyone shared the relief. In the galley, Catherine Doyle sat rigid, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles ached. The turbulence had shaken her physically, but what gnawed at her now was different humiliation. She had lost control of the cabin, lost the trust of passengers, and worst of all, been publicly overruled by her own CEO. Her mind raced, searching for a way back. If she landed with nothing, her career might never recover. The whispers would spread, the reports would pile up, and her years of service would mean nothing. She couldn't accept that. Not yet. Not without one last attempt to prove herself right. She pulled the crew phone from its cradle and pressed it to her ear, speaking in a whisper. "This is Doyle. Patch me through to ground security again." A pause. The operator's voice returned, flat. "Ms. Doyle, you've already been given direct instructions from headquarters." Her voice sharpened. "I know. But listen to me. When we land, that family is going to ignite chaos at the gate. There will be reporters, cameras, protesters. If we don't prepare, this will turn into a spectacle that damages this airline permanently." Silence stretched, and for a moment, Catherine thought she might have been cut off. Then the operator replied carefully, "Your instructions remain: no escalation, no removals. You are to maintain order. Nothing more." Catherine's chest tightened. She slammed the phone back into its cradle, her pulse racing. She felt the walls closing in on her. She was trapped, powerless, her authority stripped bare. Yet as she sat there, an idea began to take shape in her mind. If she could not remove the family herself, perhaps she could influence the perception of what had happened. A few careful words in the incident report, a few lines shifted, twisted. Make it sound as though the family had been aggressive, that the passengers had been misled. After all, perception was reality, wasn't it? But then she remembered the phones, the cameras, the live stream that had gone far beyond this cabin. Her hand trembled slightly. No matter what she wrote, there would be evidence that contradicted her version. For the first time that night, Catherine Doyle felt truly cornered. Out in the cabin, Lillian Guyon walked the aisle softly, checking on passengers. She paused by the Colemans, her expression warm but cautious. "Can I get you anything? Water?" Maybe David met her eyes, reading the quiet sincerity there. "We're fine. Thank you for asking." She gave a small nod, almost as if to say more, but deciding against it. She moved on, but her glance toward Catherine as she passed the galley was telling. It was the glance of someone who had seen too much, who knew where the fault lines really lay. Isabella Cruz whispered to her phone again, her voice trembling with excitement. "You guys won't believe this, but the CEO of East Coast Airline spoke directly to us during the flight. This is history in the making. This family, the Colemans, they're becoming a symbol right now, and everyone is watching. In row 14. David heard her words faintly, though she wasn't speaking to him. He turned his gaze inward, feeling the weight of what was happening settle on him. He hadn't asked to be a symbol. He hadn't wanted this attention. He only wanted to travel with his family, to sit in peace. And yet here they were, their story amplified beyond the cabin, woven into the fabric of something larger. Angela touched his hand gently. "You're thinking about the responsibility, aren't you?" He nodded. "Yes. If this is bigger than us, then we have to carry it carefully." She smiled faintly. "You always do." Naomi looked up from her journal, her eyes shining with something deeper than her 15 years. "Dad," she said softly, "sometimes history chooses people, not the other way around." Her words struck him like truth carved in stone. He reached over, squeezing her hand. The plane hummed steadily now, cutting through calm air as though nothing had ever disturbed it. But David knew better. The cabin might look serene, but under the surface, fractures remained. Catherine's pride was a fault line that had not yet settled. And as the plane began its gradual descent, the city lights twinkling faintly below, he felt it in his bones. The real turbulence was not behind them. It was waiting on the ground. The seatbelt sign chimed softly above the rows, its yellow glow flickering to life. A ripple of movement spread through the cabin as passengers straightened, fastening belts, securing loose items, preparing themselves for the long drop back to earth. From his seat, David Coleman felt the shift in the plane's rhythm. The engines hummed lower, their roar settling into a steady vibration as Captain Reed guided the jet downward. Out the window. The dark veil of night was breaking into a faint horizon, where scattered city lights sparkled like distant constellations. For most passengers, the descent meant relief that the ordeal was nearly over, relief that the chaos of the night would finally find an endpoint. Conversations buzzed quietly. Tentative smiles appeared, and even laughter drifted like timid birds returning after a storm. But not everyone felt relief. Catherine Doyle sat in her jump seat near the galley, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture the very image of professionalism. But inside, her thoughts raged. Every second of this flight had become a humiliation, her authority undermined, her reputation shredded before her eyes. She could not simply land and walk away with nothing. She needed one last attempt to prove she had been right all along. She glanced toward row 14. The Colemans sat close together, their faces calm but resolute, their presence a silent reminder of everything she had failed to control. Her jaw tightened. In her mind, she rehearsed the words she would write in her report, words that would paint them as agitators, words that might salvage her position. But she knew the truth. With cameras recording and streams already viral, no report could rewrite the night. Unless something happened, unless she forced the narrative one last time. Her eyes darted toward the intercom handset. One call to security on the ground could reignite the battle. If she could frame the family as a safety risk before touchdown, maybe, just maybe, she could justify intervention. She waited for a moment when Lily Nguyen was busy buckling herself in near the front. Slowly, quietly. Catherine reached for the handset, but this time, she wasn't alone. From across the aisle, Naomi's sharp eyes caught the movement. Her pen froze above her journal. "Dad," she whispered urgently. "She's doing something again." David looked up just in time to see Catherine's hand closing around the handset. His chest tightened. Not now. Not when they were so close. "Malik," he said quickly, his voice low but firm. "Record this." Malik already had his phone ready. With one tap, the lens captured Catherine lifting the handset, her voice dropping into a hiss. "Ground. This is Doyle. I need immediate clearance to restrain a passenger. The family in row 14 remains a threat." The words carried down the aisle, not as quietly as she thought. Heads turned, eyes widened. Isabella Cruz gasped audibly. Her phone raised high. Arthur Bell shook his head in disbelief, his voice rising with uncharacteristic anger. "This is madness. We all saw they've done nothing but sit here in peace." Catherine's face flushed, but she pressed on, speaking faster into the line. "Yes, they've incited the cabin. Multiple passengers unruly. We need security on standby at the gate." Before she could continue, Captain Reed's voice boomed over the intercom, sharp with authority. "Doyle, this is the captain. Cease immediately. I repeat, cease immediately. There is no cause for restraint." The cabin froze. Catherine's face turned pale as every passenger stared at her. The handset trembled in her grip. Naomi's young voice rang out, trembling but fierce. "Why are you lying about us? Why are you doing this?" The question cut sharper than any adult's accusation. It wasn't just anger. It was innocence demanding truth. For the first time that night, Catherine had no words. Her mouth opened, but nothing came. She stared at Naomi, at the child's wide, unblinking eyes, and felt something crumble inside her. David's voice followed, calm but unyielding. "You've had every chance to choose integrity, Catherine. Every chance to step back with dignity. But you keep choosing pride. And pride has led you here, cornered, before the very people you swore to serve." The cabin was utterly silent now, except for the steady drone of engines pulling them closer to the ground. Catherine lowered the handset slowly, her shoulders trembling. For the first time, she seemed smaller, diminished, stripped of the authority she had clung to so desperately. Lily Nguyen, her voice soft but resolute, spoke from the front. "Passengers, please remain calm. We will be landing shortly. And I assure you, there is no threat on this aircraft." Applause broke out, not thunderous, but firm, deliberate. It began with Isabella, then Arthur, then spread row by row until nearly the entire cabin joined in. A living verdict, a chorus that drowned Catherine's last attempt. David felt Angela's hand slip into his. She whispered, her eyes glistening, "We're almost there." He nodded, his voice thick with quiet triumph. "Yes, almost home." Ethan, leaning against him, looked confused. Why would she keep trying? Dad, didn't she hear the truth already? David kissed the boy's temple. "Sometimes people get trapped inside their pride, son. They stop hearing the truth, even when the whole world is shouting it, and then they fall alone." The landing gear thudded beneath them, the familiar rumble filling the cabin. Passengers tightened their belts, bracing for the descent. The ground drew closer, lights of Boston twinkling brighter with each passing second. Naomi clutched her journal, whispering softly as she wrote, "This is the part where truth lands with us." Angela looked at her daughter, tears slipping down her cheeks, and smiled. The aircraft sank lower, the runway growing larger. Inside, the cabin was tense but hopeful, unified in a way no one had expected when the night began. Even in the face of Catherine's final gambit, they had chosen to stand with truth. And as the wheels touched the earth with a jolt that rattled every bone, applause rose again, louder this time, not for the landing itself, but for the victory of dignity over pride, unity over division, truth over deception. David closed his eyes as the plane roared down the runway, whispering to himself words meant for no one but his own heart. "We've landed, and we're still standing." The wheels screeched against the runway, rubber meeting asphalt with a shudder that vibrated through every passenger's bones. The engines roared as the plane decelerated, rattling trays and shaking loose sighs of relief. Then came the familiar voice of Captain Reed over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Boston Logan International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate. On behalf of the crew, I thank you for your patience this evening." His words sounded routine, but the cabin knew better. This had been no ordinary flight. This had been a crucible. The aircraft taxied slowly toward the terminal. Outside, the lights of the airport glowed against the dark night, painting silver streaks across the wings. Inside, the passengers shifted, whispering, some wiping tears, others holding hands tighter than before. The shared ordeal had bound them in ways none of them could have predicted. David Coleman sat steady, his hand resting over Angela's. His children leaned close, their faces drawn but resilient. The storm inside the cabin had broken, but he knew the storm outside was just beginning. Malik's phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, his live stream still trending, comments multiplying by the second. Naomi clutched her journal, pen poised, as if the story wasn't finished until she wrote it. Ethan gazed out the window, wide-eyed at the sea of flashing lights awaiting them. Catherine Doyle, strapped into her jump seat, looked like a statue carved from tension. Her earlier defiance had melted into a silent dread. She had gambled and lost. The faces around her told her everything. There would be no recovering the trust she had shattered. The plane came to a stop at the gate. The chime sounded, releasing the cabin from its enforced stillness. But no one stood. Every head turned instinctively toward the front. where uniformed airport security and airline representatives waited just beyond the door. The door hissed open, and in stepped Victoria Langford, CEO of East Coast Airlines. She wore no blazer of comfort, no mask of detachment, only a sharp suit and an expression honed by years of making hard decisions. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her presence commanded the room. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Victoria Langford. I've come aboard personally to thank you for your patience and to address what has happened tonight." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Isabella Cruz lifted her phone higher, streaming every word. Arthur Bell sat taller, his eyes fixed on the woman who represented the airline itself. Langford turned toward the Colemans. "Mr. Coleman, Mrs. Coleman, and family, on behalf of East Coast Airlines, I extend my deepest apologies for the treatment you have endured. What happened on this flight was unacceptable. It does not represent who we strive to be, nor what we stand for." Angela inclined her head slightly, her expression dignified but cautious. David remained still, his eyes locked with hers. He wanted more than words. He wanted accountability. Victoria shifted her gaze to the cabin at large. "To all passengers, thank you for bearing witness tonight. Your courage to speak, to record, and to hold us accountable is invaluable. Airlines exist because of the trust you place in us. Tonight, that trust was broken, and we must earn it back." Applause rose slowly, spreading row by row. The passengers weren't just clapping for her words, they were clapping for the truth finally acknowledged. Catherine's breath came sharp, her face flushed. She spoke suddenly, her voice cracking. "This isn't fair. They disrupted the cabin. They provoked me. I was only following procedure." The cabin went silent. Dozens of eyes swung toward her, filled with disbelief. Naomi's young voice pierced the quiet. "No, we were quiet. We were peaceful. You tried to make us look dangerous because of how we look." Her words struck harder than any accusation. There was no anger in them, only truth spoken plainly, with the raw clarity of innocence. Victoria turned to Catherine, her expression immovable. "Ms. Doyle, your behavior tonight has been documented thoroughly, not just by passengers, but by our own review systems, effective immediately. You are relieved of duty pending full investigation." Gas spread through the cabin. Catherine's mouth fell open, but no sound came. Her authority, her career, her pride, it all fell away in that instant. She sank back into her seat, staring at the floor. David finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Justice isn't about punishment. It's about truth. Tonight, the truth is visible for all to see. That's all we ever wanted." Victoria nodded, her eyes softening. "And that truth will not be ignored." Passengers began gathering their belongings, but something had shifted. No one rushed. They moved slowly, deliberately, glancing often toward the Coleman family. Some offered words as they passed. "Thank you for standing strong. You spoke for all of us. We'll remember this." Isabella Cruz paused before them. Her phone still lit. "The world is watching you now," she said softly, "and I think they're going to follow." Arthur Bell touched David's shoulder gently. "Son, you carried yourself with grace. Don't ever forget that." David clasped the older man's hand with respect. "Thank you." As the family gathered their bags, Ethan tugged his father's sleeve. "Dad, are we safe now?" David crouched, looking into his son's eyes. "Yes, son, we're safe, and more than that, we're seen." Angela placed her arm around Ethan, adding gently, "Sometimes being seen is the first step to being safe." The Colemans walked down the aisle together, shoulders squared, heads high. Every step was heavy with the weight of what had happened, yet lifted by the knowledge that they had not bowed, had not broken. As they exited, flashbulbs exploded in the terminal. Reporters crowded the glass, microphones poised, voices calling out questions. Malik lifted his phone one last time, capturing the moment as his father stepped into the light of the terminal. David paused, the cameras catching the calm strength in his eyes. "We are not here to fight," he said clearly. "We are here to be treated with dignity. Tonight is not just our story. It is a reminder that respect should never be optional. Not in the skies, not anywhere." The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in a surge of applause and shouts of agreement. The family continued forward, swallowed by the lights and voices, their silhouettes carved against the glow of the terminal. Behind them, Catherine Doyle was escorted off separately, her head bowed, her figure small against the enormity of what she had lost. But the Colemans walked together, unbroken, strong, and as they moved into the night air beyond the terminal, their story was already becoming more than just an incident on a flight. It was becoming a symbol that in the face of prejudice, dignity could stand tall, that in the roar of injustice, truth could still be heard, that when the skies trembled, humanity could still land together, stronger than before. What began as a quiet family trip ended as a moment of truth for an entire plane and for all of us watching. The Coleman family's story is not just about a flight. It's about respect. It's about the courage to hold on to dignity when the world tries to strip it away. Tonight, we saw a family stand strong, even when falsely accused. We saw strangers become allies, their voices rising against injustice. And we saw a reminder that silence in the face of prejudice is never neutral. It's a choice. Catherine Doyle's downfall was not simply her own pride. It was the weight of a system that too often overlooks, dismisses, and dehumanizes. But against that weight stood truth. Against that darkness stood light. And the message echoes long after the landing: respect should never be optional. Not in the skies, not on the ground, not anywhere. So, what will you carry from this story? Will you be the bystander? Or will you be the one who speaks when silence feels safer? If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can make sure voices like these are never ignored again.